Hey everybody, it's Virgil here at the Chapo Annex in Bushwick. Think of it as like a second home that we use for our assignations. And with us today on this beautiful sunny day in Brooklyn is Sam Cedar, host of the Majority Report. Hey Sam, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Virgil. This is like a second home.
Sam has been kind enough to invite me on his program a few times, and as part of our podcast exchange program, we're having him on. I after one of these tapings, when I visited the Majority Report Manor in downtown Brooklyn, Sam and I got to talking about something in his past, a kind of dark chapter in his personal history, and that came up because a few weeks ago I went on the Current Affairs podcast after months of hectoring them into having me on. I forgot why I wanted to go on in the first place. It's one of those things, like the dog catching the bumper.
Yes, I understand. Well, you're current.
Yeah, I'm current. I mean, I'm familiar with current affairs. I read a lot of posts on a weekly basis, so I am basically qualified to be a pundit.
Right. Everyone is almost.
So they asked me about my favorite subject, me, and they got deep into the meaning of Chapo, right? Why is it so successful? How does it fit into the socialist movement? All that kind of stuff. And there's a kind of form question that we get, that's why socialism? Why is socialism a thing now? That all just seemed to come out of nowhere a few years back. And I mean, I have like various answers to that question. I think everything kind of contributes a little bit to that. Usually it's around it's a response to austerity and the financial meltdown. It's a response to the Iraq War. It's especially a lot of young people who grew up in this militarized milieu, all kinds of things like that. And of course, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders were very influential on that. But the way he posed the question was like, why is socialist podcasting a thing now? And how come, why come there no left on the radio? Which I did not really have a form answer for, because although I am probably the country's foremost media critic by virtue of co-hosting this show, I don't really know things about the past, outside of, posts. And I kind of stammered my way through it, kind of tried to fit my answer into that stock answer that I have. But in reality, I never knew why conservative talk radio was such a big influential thing, and it was, as we wrote in our book.
I think it still is.
It still absolutely still is, and as we wrote in our book, Newt Gingrich was crowned as a honorary member of the freshman class of '94 of the Republican Revolution class.
Rush Limbaugh was.
Rush Limbaugh, yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Newt Gingrich was actually in that.
Oh, Newt
class.
Gingrich. Oh, fuck, Christ. Okay, now we got to restart the whole thing.
You already revealed your lack of historical grounding.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I read the book, and the book taught me everything I need to know about history. But like the actual talk radio thing, I mean, I've read some various compelling pieces of compelling arguments about why conservative talk radio was such a big thing. Is such a big thing. One thesis is that it has a lot to do with car culture. If you're in if you live in rural or suburban areas, you necessarily drive a lot and you need something to listen to.
Right.
And if you live in an urban area where you take public transit, before there were iPods, you didn't really have anything to listen to unless you could listen to Rush Limbaugh on tape or something like that.
Really, before Walkman.
But
that's why I'm here, to remind you that there was actually something before iPods, but
record scratch.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I think that's part of it in terms of who it appeals to. I also think that it was a bit of a fluke. I think there's a lot more money on the right, and the talk radio, conservative talk radio, heavily subsidized in many different ways, not necessarily directly, but as a bank shot. The quick answer, and we could really wrap this up in just like 2 minutes.
Okay, that's good for me. I got to be somewhere.
In terms of like why there's a lot more that the left is much more competitive in the podcast world, particularly just sort of like podcast only, as opposed to the podcast of a radio show or something like that,
Right, right.
is because the bar to entry is so low. And the bar to entry on radio is quite large.
Well, I'm also thinking of this in terms of audiences. You talk about how right-wing radio is so heavily subsidized. But it also, it also commands big audiences.
Huge audiences.
I mean, Rush Limbaugh, I mean, in some way, the powers that be, the people who control the radio and the advertising and so on and so forth, have to follow where the market is, surely.
Oh yeah, but I mean that market was to a certain extent in terms of like political talk as opposed to just talk radio, and I think talk radio in and of itself is amenable in some respects more to like a broadly more conservative outlook. Just if you look at the more generic like sort of talk radio hosts that came before Limbaugh, to be, I guess, a talk radio fan, you would probably be a little bit more oriented towards the right, broadly speaking. But with all that said, and I think, part of the reason why I'm here is to dispel the notion that there was no market for left-wing AM talk radio. Because the fact is, and this is the dirty little secret about Air America, we got very good numbers. I mean, very good ratings. And we just had really bad management. In fact, that understates it because we had a series of bad management. Air America launched on March 30th of 2004, and it collapsed, I believe it was in late 2010. And over the course of, was it 2010 or maybe even maybe late 2009, over the course of those 5 or so years, there was 6 CEOs and 5 different owners, not including a period of time where we were in receivership and there was no owner. And it was an amazing series of people who didn't know what they were doing.
Let's rewind a little bit. Let's go back to the beginning because most of our listeners were born after 2010.
Yes.
What was Air America?
Okay. So now this is actually like really hard, I think, honestly, for a lot of people who are probably listening to appreciate. But in 2004, there was zero left, and I'm using that term broadly, mass media. There was nothing. The closest thing to it was Phil Donahue. I mean, you're laughing. I mean, he was about as left as it got, and on mass media, and he was just left because he was just sort of wimpy. Like it was almost like that was the definition. He was just like a guy who, was overly polite in some way. I mean, he had more politics than that.
And you also had Alan Combs.
Alan Combs, right, was also on the left. I think
he was a Marxist.
Sometime around there, he would be the co-host with Sean Hannity on. And he was basically the, for folks who have ever seen the Harlem Globetrotters, he was the Washington Wizards. And you can imagine where that put him relative to how expert Sean Hannity was.
For a more current reference, he was the Todd to Sean Hannity's BoJack Horseman.
Right, exactly. Okay, so there you go. And so there was nothing on TV. Keith Olbermann had yet to sort of like emerge. There was Democracy Now!, and that was it. And that was all public access and on non-commercial radio. But that was it. And
I remember you had a lot of books. That was when the rise of the great liberal anti-Bush book.
Well, actually, there was only 2. There was Al Franken's Lying Liars, and I think he may have had one before that.
Yeah,
and there was Michael Moore, and that was it. I mean, there was yet to be, those books did not start coming out until like 2004, largely speaking. And because you have to also remember that the Bush years, particularly those first 3 or 4 years, was so much in the shadow of 9/11. And there was a real fear. So Air America, the idea came up around in 2003. They approached Al Franken. They started to build it around Al Franken. They approached Janine Garofalo. I think she was probably the second person who was approached. And Janine and I had talked about doing a radio show, for a long time. I was at that time directing I'm with Busey, which was a Comedy Central fake reality show out in L.A. But I had
Wait, that was what was it called?
I'm with Busey, Gary Busey.
About Gary Busey. I
Yes.
vaguely remember.
Yes,
that.
it was a nightmare. But nevertheless, so I was a comedian, and but I had sort of educationally a background in politics, and had done all the internships and that type of thing, and was very intensely anti-war as the buildup to Iraq was coming. And in fact, the first Majority Report was actually done on Tom Sharpling's best show on WFMU, which some people may know as a podcast now. You gave me 2 hours to do it in February of 2003, right before the launch of the Iraq War. And John Benjamin, who voices my show, we went over to New Jersey and we did it live. And it was a time where you had no sense of dissent. And literally Janine Garofalo was the only person who was allowed on television to say we shouldn't go to a war with Iraq, because they wouldn't let anyone else on. And so she was recruited by this organization, Win Without War, because she was the only person they would let on. And they would do that because they'd invite her on, desperate to have her on. Because she was great for ratings, particularly on Fox, because they love to see, young women who are, uppity, get attacked. That is like catnip for them. And so they invite her on, and the first question would be like, how dare you come on here as an actress and tell us why we shouldn't go to war? So Air America launches with Al Franken, Rachel Maddow and Liz Winstead, and Chuck D had a show in the morning. And Mark Maron had a show in the early morning with a couple other folks, Al Franken, and then Randy Rhodes, who was a left-wing talker from Florida, but just all local. There was no...
Yeah. I mean, there was definitely local.
Yes, there was local, and then after us, we were 6 to 9 or 7 to 10, I think we started. After us, there was a guy named Mike Malloy, who again also had been doing that local stuff. And so the problem was, it was started by a guy who told everyone that he had had a brain tumor, and that he had had a revelation that he needed to do something to get, we were losing the messaging war because there was no messenger at all. And there was literally no commercial media.
This is like if Felix started a company. I have a brain tumor. I can't be alone right now. Will you and your comedian friends come to my house and record a daily radio program?
It was very much like that. It was insanity. And it turns out the guy was lying about how much money he had raised. It took a while to find this out. It basically came to a head, and people can watch this element of the period of Air America. There was a documentary called, maybe I think it was Left of the Dial or something like that, on HBO. My understanding is that a lot of us had not gotten paid. But, I was coming from the sitcom world, and I was like, I don't really care. I mean, I thought I was just going to do this.
You were rolling in the Gary Busey money.
I was rolling in. I had done a lot of sitcom as an actor. I was actually rolling in a lot of dough at that time. And we were just like, we need to do something for the next 6 months before this election. And so a lot of us had checks that were bounced, and they would just say like, well, there was some confusion and blah, blah. And it all came to a head when Franken, who had not been paid for a long time, the guy sent his consigliere with a big envelope that supposedly had all the receipts for the checks that they had. And he opened it up, and it was just random newspaper clippings, like that old, like back in the day in the 80s, you could be walking down the street of New York, and somebody would come up and sell you a VCR. and it was shrink wrapped, and you put your hand in where the slot was, and they had just, you got it home, you opened it up, you found out it was just like a piece of plastic that you could put your hand in. And it was basically one of those. And the whole thing was about to come crashing down, but a new set of owners stepped in, and then a new set of owners and a new set of owners. But all the while, our ratings were great.